It might start to feed back a little bit, so hopefully that won't happen though.
So just hold you up there 1 second. So what we'll do, questions, if it's all right, is just pop your hand up and I'll come over so that I can repeat the question and we can share it with everyone.
What's the difference between pulling needles and cutting needles?
So it depends on the species that you're working with as to whether or not you're going to pull the needles by hand or cut the needles with scissors. So what I'm doing with a black pine like this time of year, there's not a lot of water pumping through the tree, so I'm not worried about the tree bleeding by pulling the needles. If it were midsummer, and maybe if it were something like a white pine, which is actually the next tree we're going to be working on, those trees tend to bleed quite a bit more than a black pine, so I'd be a little more concerned about pulling the needles. And what I'd probably do is, instead of pulling, I would use the scissors and I'd cut whatever needles that I wanted to remove. I'd cut them back and leave a 1 or 2 millimeter stub at the base. That'll prevent bleeding, and that 1 to 2 millimeter stub will fall off within a couple of weeks. All right, so it all depends on whether or not the tree is bleeding profusely when you pull those needles. Obviously, pulling the needles is a lot easier. It's a lot faster than going through and cutting individual needles. So just for speed, typically I'll pull the needles, but again, it depends on the species of pine that I'm working with.
Bjorn, is that the same with red pines?
Yeah, it's the same with red pines. Really, every individual tree is going to be slightly different. So it's not that all black pines you should pull the needles and all white pines you should cut the needles. There are some white pines, as you start to pull the needles, they bleed. Some white pines won't bleed. Same with the red pines, same with the black pines. So typically I just start by pulling the needles. If I notice a lot of sap or bleeding coming out of the tree, then I'll switch over to cutting those needles back. Now, in terms of actually cutting the needles in half to shorten the length of the needles, I don't recommend that you do that on any tree, particularly with trees like white pines, because they'll bleed quite a lot if you cut directly through the needles right in half. And it also looks like a haircut, which we don't necessarily want. What we want to try to do is balance the energy of the tree so that the tree produces a consistent kind of even needle length through that balancing process. And that involves decandling the tree at the right time in the summer.
And Bjorn, you just mentioned there balancing the energy of the tree. Is that something that you take into consideration for every tree you work on?
Yeah, absolutely. With black and red pines, which are what are called double flush pines, meaning that you can induce a second flush of growth in a single growing season by decandling the tree. That process of balancing the energy on the tree is done through very specific techniques at specific times of the year to produce a certain needle length. So with a tree like this, they're getting a little feedback. All right. With a tree like this, it's not a large tree, but it's bigger than a medium-sized tree. So the needle length we would want on a plant about this size would be ideally probably a little bit smaller than this right here. Right? This is just a little bit long. So in order to reduce that needle size on a tree like this, we would want to decandle or remove those candles at the right time of the year, a little bit later in the growing season. The longer you wait into the growing season, the smaller the second flush of growth is going to be. So typically what we'll do with larger trees, we'll start with those earlier in the summer, decandling those. Then by midsummer, we'll be working on the medium-sized trees, and by kind of mid to late summer, we'll start working on the Shohin-sized trees in terms of decandling. That way the needle size is in balance with the overall size of the tree. Now here, you're going to have to kind of experiment as to when exactly the best time is to do that. So for example, in Japan, we're in the northern hemisphere up there. So in Japan, we're looking at starting the decandling process about mid-June, whereas in Tennessee, which is still in the northern hemisphere, we're offset by just a couple of weeks. So we actually have to start earlier at the end of May rather than mid-June for those larger trees. Right? So here you're going to have to kind of experiment and see exactly when to do that. And Quentin might be a good person to talk to about that, because you got a great black pine down in the show. All the needles are just the right length for that tree. When do you usually decandle that tree?
Well, interestingly, that one, interestingly, that one wasn't in all that great a health last spring, so I didn't decandle in December. So those needles you see on there are from the candles that come this season.
Okay. Okay. Did you hold off on the fertilizer this last year then to reduce that size?
Yeah, I think that was probably part of the problem. I've got too many trees, Bjorn, that's the problem, and it didn't get the treatment it should have got.
Well, it looks spectacular regardless, so it looks
Thank you.
very nice.
So Bjorn, we had a question from Gary over the side here that was, where you've plucked the needles, will it promote back budding?
Yeah, so by plucking the needles, normally what we do at Fujikawa-san's nursery in Japan is we do the decandling process and we pluck the needles at the exact same time in the middle of summer. So what I explained earlier about trying to balance the energy on the tree with the weak needles or the weak candles, leaving them completely alone. We don't cut those candles off, we leave all the needles around those areas. The medium strength ones, we cut those back and we remove all but about 10 to 12 pairs, and with the stronger candles, we leave only about 6 to 8 pairs. We do that all at once in the middle of summer. The idea being that you decandle the tree, you get that second flush of growth, so you double the ramification on the tree. You also shorten the needle length at that point. And then by plucking the needles, the old needles at that same time, you allow light and air to the inner portions of the tree during the growing season. So by allowing that light in there, it starts to help promote back budding on the tree as well. Now, if you're working with a tree that is severely lacking in back budding, what you can do is heavily fertilize that tree all through the growing season, and that will help promote the back budding. The only problem is you're going to get really long secondary growth on the trees. That shouldn't really be that big of a deal at that point. The goal should be to try to get as much back budding on the tree as possible. Once you have that foliar density on the tree, which may take a year, 2, 3 years of fertilizing through the growing season, then you can start cutting that fertilizer right after you decandle the trees. All right, so the idea being that you decandle the trees in midsummer, get that second flush of growth. While that second flush of growth is starting to emerge and harden off, if you fertilize during that period, those needles are going to get longer and longer. So if you stop fertilizing during that period, that'll help reduce the needle size to some degree as well. So you can kind of balance the energy and the size of the needles at that same point. Okay. All right, so that looks pretty solid. So now we got to figure out what we're going to do with the apex of the tree here, right? So the natural line of this tree kind of flows up through here into this area. The problem is it's very tall, kind of stretched. It has this kind of long stretched neck appearance to the tree, which gives it kind of a weak, young appearance. So like I said earlier, we're going to try to reduce this down as much as possible to draw your eye to the features of the tree, which are really kind of right in this area here. So the more this stretches, the less your eye goes to that area. So there are a couple of options. The natural line, like I said, kind of flows through here. So what we could do is put some raffia on this, bend it way back in on itself, and crank it down. The only issue with that is these branches up at the top here are quite thick, at least in comparison to the branches just below. So that proportion isn't exactly right, but the line is really nice. So maybe we'll use that, or we could reduce this completely. We could eliminate that entirely and rebuild a totally new apex on the tree, which is also a little bit tricky. So what we could do is utilize this back branch here. We could do the same thing, put some raffia on it, build it in this area here. The only problem is this branch, which I think is a really important branch here, it's a little bit difficult to use if we start using this as the apex. This comes out at a weird point on the trunk here, rather, if we use this branch here, whereas if we keep this nice line at the top here, it makes much more sense to keep this branch and utilize it. So I think we're going to go with the original option, even though the ideal branches aren't available to us up at the top here. Now, we can always remedy that by grafting at some point as well, but for this particular demonstration, we're not going to worry about grafting. We're going to do probably some raffia work at the top of the tree. Okay, so the next step is to start the wiring process. So always start with the bottom of the tree. We're going to start with our main directional branch here. We're going to be using some top-notch copper wire from Joe Morgan Paler. And he has some for sale if any of you guys are interested. So he brought this stuff in from Japan, really nice soft wire. This is all annealed copper wire here. Now with the conifers, for the most part, we're going to use copper wire. And with broadleaf trees and deciduous trees, so broadleaf evergreen and deciduous, we'll use mostly aluminum, or aluminium, as you guys say here. So this is nice soft wire from Japan. Nice thing about the Japanese wire as well is it's very clean. Doesn't have that oxidization on the outside of it, which can flake off in your eyes and be very painful. All right. So The main thing with wiring is to make sure that everything is anchored properly. We don't want things to seesaw back and forth. The second thing that's very important is to make it as clean as possible. If you have to sacrifice cleanliness to get the branches to hold, that's fine, but if you can do both at the same time, you're that much better off. So what I want to do is wire this branch right here. I want to put a little bit of movement in the actual main portion of the branch, so I need a wire thick enough. We're going to use a size 8. We may even double up on this wire as well. These are pretty stiff branches. But I'm going to follow this line up through here and connect it around to the rear of the tree, back to this branch on the back side here. And I want this to cut across the trunk as little as possible. Right? So with this particular connection here, we really don't need to go around the trunk more than one time. Right? So I'm just going to go around the front of the trunk to connect these two, and that should be enough to anchor this. Now, the directionality of the wire is only important if you're bending that branch severely one direction or the other. So this particular branch right here, that's going to be our main branch, we're going to put a little bit of movement in it side to side, maybe some movement in it up and down, but I'm not cranking that branch from one side of the tree to the other or from the front to the back. It's actually going to stay essentially where it is and just have a little movement side to side. So the directionality of the wire in this case doesn't matter that much. If though, for example, let's just say this was the front of the tree and we needed to take this branch around this direction really far. I would want to make sure that the wire in this case goes counterclockwise. Well, how do I know that? So when we're wiring a branch, at the end of the branch, we always loop the wire underneath. The idea being when you drop the branches, you can lift the tips up. If it's looped underneath, you have total control as to where that branch goes. Whatever direction that wire is pointing with that loop underneath, think of that as an arrow indicating which way you can bend the branch, and that wire will tighten as you go, right? So if I know that I need to pull it around this direction, I want that wire to end pointing this direction here, which means it's got to go counterclockwise for that to happen, and it'll tighten as we go. And vice versa if we needed to pull this branch around the opposite way. So if this branch needed to come from here to here, we'd go clockwise, so it ends underneath, and we pull it this direction. Does that make sense? Okay. For me, it's just an easy way to kind of keep track of which way we need to put the wire on. But again, in this case, it doesn't really matter. All right, so I want to be extra careful here not to smash too many needles on the tree, or any if possible. That's your job. Yeah. All right, so all of the books that you'll read, they'll all tell you to do, say, like a 45-degree angle on the wire. That always ends up looking kind of like a spring or a slinky, and it doesn't really provide a whole lot of extra holding power. So you're better off doing a much wider pitch, much wider angle. On these branches, it looks better and it holds just as well. The only exception to that would be if you're wiring broadleaf trees, which tend to be a lot more brittle than most conifers. Then you might want to do a tighter pitch, say like a 45 or even tighter. It's not that it's going to hold the branch any better for you, but it's going to potentially keep it from snapping when you go to bend it in place a bit later. You always want to wire toward yourself if possible and support the branch with one hand as you twist the wire around with the other hand. So I'm right-handed, so I'll use my left hand and I'll pinch the wire at the base of the branch or the trunk, whatever I'm applying it to, and I'll use my right hand, I'll let it go through the palm of my hand, and I'll use my pointer finger and my thumb to get it nice and tight up against the branch. I don't want to have any gaps, if possible, between the wire and the branch that I'm applying it to, because when I go to bend that later, if there are any gaps there, it will likely break in those areas. All right, so all you got to do is build up a little bit of strength in your pointer finger and your thumb, and you can put on this size 8 or 6 or even size 4 copper wire very easily. And if you buy wire from Joe Morgan Paler, it's very soft and easy to put on.
Is there a show special there, Joe? Show special? Was there?
There is. So 5+ kilos, it's $25
Beautiful. Thank you very much. Bjorn, you mentioned there that you're wiring for strength and just concerned about how much bending you're going to put in and could there be any breakages. Have you been working on any significant trees where that's occurred and you've actually broken and had to recover?
Yeah, actually the very first demo I ever did in the United States, I was in Kentucky. I think it was Louisville or Lexington, Kentucky. and they had a juniper for me to wire. And there were probably about half as many people there at that event as there are here. So maybe a good 100, 110 people at that event. I got through the whole demonstration. I got to the very apex of the tree. Everything was going great. I wired the apex. I went through to bend the apex, and it snapped completely off. So at that point, it was my first demo, so I hadn't really developed a good poker face to hide it. So it showed, it was written right on my face what had happened. So we had to redesign the tree right in the last couple of minutes of the demonstration. So hopefully that won't happen today. It hasn't happened since, but you never know.
It's all part of the learning process.
That's always a possibility, yeah. But if it does happen today, my poker face is really good, so you guys won't know anyway.
So the question there being, what do you think the reason was that it did break?
I was probably, well, with the base of the tree, the bottom half of the tree, it was very flexible, so I think I just got overly confident when I got to the very top of the tree. Figured I could move it in the same way that I could move the bottom portion of the tree. But there was probably a bit of dead wood running through that last portion of the apex, and that's what broke it off. Went to bend it, and it just snapped. I like the way you think, yeah. We'll go with that. So I'm doing the larger structural wire here first on this back branch, and then the bottom branch, and then we'll set those. So it all depends on kind of your personal approach and how you want to apply the wire to these trees as to whether or not you do an individual branch and set that branch, meaning you do all of the detail wiring and set that one branch, or if you just do the structural wiring, set the big branches, and then go back and do the detail later. 9 times out of 10 for me, particularly with a tree like this that already sort of has the basic structure set up, I like to detail each individual branch and set that branch before I move on to the next portion of the tree. If I'm working with a more raw piece of material, I'll eliminate everything that I think that I don't need right up front, so the types of growth that we talked about earlier. Then I'll wire sort of the main structural branches, set all of those, and then go back and do a little bit of the detail towards the end. So it all just depends, but that's a personal preference. So there's not one right way or one wrong way to do things. And that's one issue in teaching bonsai, is that there's so many variables that you have to take into consideration. There are no sort of hard and fast rules. You're talking about each plant is different, genetically speaking. So you could have 10 trident maples side by side with each other, but they might all dry out at different rates during the day. Their growth habits are all going to be different if they come from seed or from different parent stock. So you really have to understand your environment and understand how each tree reacts in that environment, and then sort of adjust to that as you go. All right. So what I try to do when I set the wire up on each of these branches here is think 2 steps ahead, meaning what am I going to wire next to what else? So I want to try to avoid crossing as much as possible. That's keeping it nice and clean, like what we talked about earlier. And I want to make sure that I'm wiring branches together that have similar thickness and similar pliability. So I wouldn't want to wire a tiny branch like this together with a big thick branch like this. We need to kind of be discerning as to what we wire together. And I also don't want to wire every single individual branch on the tree. I want to be strategic in terms of what we apply wire to, both for time purpose and for an economic purpose as well, because copper wire can be expensive. Unless you buy it from Joe Morgan Paler, and it's a good deal. So, am I doing a good job? All right. Okay. Yeah, we should have worked something out. So if you're going to buy copper wire, though, what you want to do is buy really everything from size 8 to 20. So it's every other number, so 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20. That size range should cover you for the most part. It's very rare that you'll need 22, and unless you're doing major bending on big trees, you're probably not going to need a size 6 or a 4. So everything up to about a size 8 and then down to about a size 20 will be just about right.